Estamos ao vivo.
Bom, boa noite a todos que estão nos assistindo. Dando continuidade, então, ao evento nas Trilhas do Rock. Bom, hoje nós contamos com a presença do professor David Simonelli, que é uma inspiração, foi e é, né, uma inspiração para todos aqui no grupo, entre outras coisas, porque foi o livro esse livro, né, Working Class Hero, que, enfim, acho que incentivou a todos nós aqui a começar a fazer pesquisa sobre esse assunto, sobre o rock aqui na Unesp de Franca. Então é um prazer enorme contar com a presença do professor David. E antes de passar a palavra para o professor David, eu queria só deixar registrado aqui o agradecimento, primeiro, ao Grupo de Estudos Culturais da Unesp, que organizou e está realizando esse evento, e, em particular, ao José César, que sem ele não teria ocorrido esse evento, e também para a Lívia, que está sendo a nossa tradutora aqui. Bom, então agora eu vou passar a palavra para o professor David, e agradeço mais uma vez a presença de todos.
Thank you. Ready to go? Oh, there we go. All right. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to do this. My paper is entitled Psychedelic and Progressive Rock and Revolution in Britain, Which Revolution? The rhetoric of revolution was in the air in Britain in the later 1960s, but the possibility of revolution seemed to dissipate in the same way as everywhere else in the world during the era. In 1968, Parisian students challenged the de Gaulle presidency in France and brought millions of people out in the streets. The violence accompanying the Democratic National Convention in Chicago seemed to presage the collapse of the US war effort in Vietnam. Mexican students were shot in the streets surrounding the National University on the verge of the Olympic Games being held there. Everyone in Czechoslovakian society came out to stand up to the Eastern European tanks sent to crush their aspirations during the Prague Spring. All came to nothing in terms of political change. In London, a protest outside the US Embassy saw horses and police set upon the crowd. The Observer, Mick Jagger, was inspired to write Street Fighting Man to make sense of the moment. Well, what can a poor boy do except to sing for a rock and roll band? Seemed like appropriate sentiment for the time. There was little societal interest or effort in casting away the British parliamentary system and the culture that supported it in favor of a new approach to politics, government, and society. Nevertheless, the countercultural elite of the 1960s and 1970s set out to try and invented psychedelic rock and progressive rock music and its musicians as the vehicles to lead the revolution. It is critical to begin by describing exactly what psychedelic rock was, particularly in Britain in the 1960s. Perhaps the most important idea is that while the music may have originally been inspired by the experience of psychedelic drug trips, the idea of psychedelic experiences, and thus of a psychedelic revolution, metastasized well beyond the limiting experience of taking LSD or psilocybin or mescaline. In other words, one did not have to trip in order to find the experience of listening to psychedelic rock music revolutionary. The rock writer and critic Jim DeRogatis gives perhaps the best definition. In Turn On Your Mind, 4 Decades of Great Psychedelic Rock, DeRogatis argues, psychedelic rock doesn't mean drug rock, but rock that is inspired by a philosophical approach implied by the literal meanings of psychedelic as mind-revealing and soul-manifesting. Psychedelic rock offers something for the intellect as well as the body. In DeRogatis' vision, psychedelic rock is a virtually abstract art for the listener in that the appreciation of it requires an open mind. The musicologist Sheila Whiteley provided definitions for the limits torn down by DeRogatis. She argued that there was a common set of markers that defined what made music psychedelic beyond the borders of the drug trip. This psychedelic coding, as she termed it, saw musicians cast different instruments' tonal colors against each other, bright melodies and harmonies, sometimes contrasting with menacing drones, and irregular, perhaps non-Western rhythms, creating collages of sound. What made them psychedelic was not just those musical definitions, but the contexts in which they were heard. In the 1960s and 1970s, young people were exploring communal living and experimenting with drugs and looking for a spiritual meaning in their lives that they could not find in their parents' lives. Listening to the music itself was a form of liberation from circumstance. In fact, the entire experience of the album, from the sound to the setting to the simple analysis of the record album cover, was an escape from reality. The idea of psychedelic rock then was as much a construct of the listener and their circumstances as it was the intent of the musician, a revolutionary circumstance all by itself. As defined in the 1960s by the Harvard psychologists Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, key elements in a psychedelic trip are set, the history, experiences, traumas, moods, and personality the drug taker brings to the trip, and setting, the climate and circumstances surrounding the drug taker while taking the trip. It follows then that the experience of psychedelic music requires the same circumstances to be truly mind-expanding. In fact, at its best, the music creates set and setting for the listener, becoming defining in and of itself. This adds the element of the sublime to the experience. If psychedelic and progressive rock music were windows through which the historian can see a social and cultural revolution taking place in Britain in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it then stands to reason that there had to be something which psychedelic rock listeners wanted to escape from, a reason for desiring the change that a revolution would bring about. This requires less definition. While the 1960s and 1970s were an exciting time to be a young person growing up in Britain, particularly in London and other cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, or Newcastle, any cursory gaze into the future would reveal a lot to be worried about. The nation's strategic, diplomatic, economic, and political position in the world was being dismantled regularly as the former British Empire was liquidated in favor of independent countries. At the same time, people from all over the former colonies were in the process of migrating to Britain for improved economic opportunity. The Race Relations Acts of 1965 and 1968 prohibited racial discrimination in response to immigration from Commonwealth countries, but were publicly opposed by the conservative member of parliament, Enoch Powell, who became a hero to many white people for predicting rivers of blood to come from the opening of the nation's borders. The economic boom of the 1950s had never matched that of the 6 nations who made up the European Economic Community, and by November 1967, just 5 months after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper was released, the government had to devalue the pound in the worst economic crisis since the austerity following the Second World War. In the same year, Britain's application to join the European Economic Community was rejected for a second time. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association began its marches in favor of Catholic equality in the apartheid state set up by Protestants. By 1968, scenes of Royal Ulster Constabulary officers cracking marchers' skulls were a regular sight on BBC television. A year later, British Army troops themselves were in Belfast and Derry, trying to keep the peace. Unemployment reached 800,000 in April 1971, as high as it had been since the end of the economic depression of the 1930s. Miners and other nationalized workers went on strike in 1972, and the government had to announce a wage and price freeze by the end of the year to curb inflation at the same time. Joining the EEC in 1973 was mitigated by the impact of an OPEC oil embargo accompanying the Yom Kippur War at the end of the year. The lack of coal and oil as energy sources was so difficult to manage that the Heath government passed a law setting a speed limit of 50 miles per hour on Britain's highways and reduced the work week to 3 days starting on the first day of 1974 in order to conserve heat and electricity. Literary works, particularly written by Marxists, reflected the need for a revolution in values and perhaps even in government. Historians, literary critics, and critics of culture in general came out with works which called for a very similar rebirth in British Romantic cultural traditions, values that would often echo those of British youth. E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class from 1964, Raymond Williams's Culture and Society from 1958, and Richard Hogarth's The Uses of Literacy from 1957 all were widely read in popular circles and all were reflective of their times and values. They emphasized the creation of culture by the common people, the elevation of their creations into the realm of high art, especially in how it was marketed and sold, and they all played up the nationalistic potential of this moment. In a Cold War world, British culture could and should become a model to the rest of the world for what a moral common culture ought to be and how it should be grounded in natures, in the values of working people, in the expansion of minds and the opening of hearts to a connection across classes, genders, and differences, and races. Hogarth established the University of Birmingham's Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies for just these purposes. It eventually became a Marxist institution dedicated to Gramsci's idea of culture as a forum for the negotiation between classes. The critical texts they produced included Dick Hebdige's Subculture, The Meaning of Style from 1979, and Stuart Hall and T. Jefferson's Resistance Through Rituals from 1976. Each of them about how youth subcultures established a forum in which class tensions were relieved. Basically, at the height of the rock music era, in which psychedelic and progressive rock musicians talked regularly about revolution, there seemed ample evidence available in British life that there was a need for one. This was hardly an exclusively British phenomenon. In response to the pressure of an uncertain future, youth identity grew in the Western world in the late 60s, based on an asserted division from older generations and what were considered to be their bankrupt, materialistic middle-class values, especially as displayed in the vicissitudes of the Cold War. Vietnam, civil rights in America and South Africa, student protest, drugs, the May 1968 student revolt in Paris, young people all over the world were opposed to the same values. And there was little doubt where kids looked to for inspiration when it came to defying the prevailing cultural establishment. Rock and roll music as a cultural medium had been in opposition to adult values since its inception. It was both the soundtrack to change and the leader of it. In the 1960s, the proliferation of psychedelics would change the music to make it reflective of the revolution taking place in listeners' heads. Then the music would try to become the revolution itself, first as rock, then as progressive rock. It was music that promised a similar sensory experience as psychedelic drugs, and music that would inspire youth politicians, journalists, and the musicians themselves to foreground it as the soundtrack to an alleged youth revolution. The first psychedelic single is often credited to the Kinks with See My Friends, produced in July 1965, with a heavy simulated drone sound that mimicked the Indian tambura. With its dipping up and down harmony, electric guitar picking its way through the murky soundscape, and Ray Davies' monotone vocals, See My Friends is often considered the first Western attempt to capture the sound of an Indian raga in an electric setting. Likewise, The Who's Anyhow, Anyway, Anywhere incorporated a guitar solo featuring electronic feedback as distortion, introducing a hypnotic sound to the pop chart that would become common over the next 5 years. But as with everything else about British music in the 60s, the acknowledged masters of the psychedelic aesthetic were the Beatles. Rubber Soul came out in late 1965, with its distorted photo of the band on the cover beneath a bubble font of the album name. The Beatles produced a cover worth looking at as a work of art. Norwegian Wood was the first of many later album tracks from George Harrison to feature sitar. Revolver took these new paradigms even further in 1966. While Rubber Soul was the last of the band's marijuana albums, several of the tracks on Revolver, especially Tomorrow Never Knows, were inspired by LSD, the writings of Timothy Leary, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Rain, Strawberry Fields Forever, and Penny Lane staked out the ground on which psychedelic rock would flourish. Of course, then 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band became the greatest psychedelic rock album ever released, a full sensory experience from its album cover to the musical effects to its loose connection between songs allegedly recorded by a mysterious alter ego music hall band by Sgt. Pepper. British listeners considered psychedelic rock to be underground music, the music of radical London-based counterculture journals like International Times and Oz. Representative bands in the late 1960s included Pink Floyd, The Soft Machine, The Incredible String Band, King Crimson, the Edgar Broughton Band, and others. The counterculture journals that hyped these acts likewise promoted the ideas of the future youth political revolution they allegedly represented. The proliferation of rock, psychedelic rock, underground music, or however one chose to term it, was the vanguard of a coming youth revolution where minds would be blown the same way they were at all these bands' concerts. The psychedelic music that they responded to was born out of the experience of its musicians in Britain's art colleges, incubators for the notion of cultural and eventually social and psychedelic experimentation. There, students were exposed to modern jazz and its emphasis on improvisation. They were also influenced by experimental European composers like Stockhausen, Boulez, and Satie. Always central to the British educational experience was exposure to traditional folk music, but with the expanding Commonwealth immigrant population came folk music from all over the former empire, Indian, Arabian, African, and Afro-Caribbean music especially. The texts they read, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Kenneth Grahame's The Wind in the Willows, Lewis Carroll's work, The Romantic Poets, presented them with an ideological and pastoral utopianism, which resulted often in lyrics rooted in fantasy, exotic religious themes, or political pacifism. All of these tenets were likewise found in the 18th and 19th century conceptions of Romanticism. What seemed to an 18-year-old aspiring graphic artist or ambitious countercultural journalist to be fresh new ways of looking at the world had been inspirational to their cultural forebears for 200 years previous. This made the work of youth revolution imparted through psychedelic music seem simultaneously avant-garde and yet representing vaguely familiar values, lending an air of comfort to the idea of revolution, and also commerciality. The essential starting point for psychedelic rock was psychedelic drugs. Referring again to Sheila Whiteley's The Space Between the Notes from 1992, musicians manipulated the timbre of music, sliding upwards on the musical scale with oscillating and sometimes irregular rhythms. The idea for soloists like Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix was to mimic in music the roller coaster ride of the brain on LSD. Likewise, Pink Floyd emphasized light shows in concert that mimicked the visuals of a trip. This was seen as a form of subversion on the part of the bands involved, as if they were offering the listener at a concert a psychedelic trip without having to take the actual drugs. Adding to the atmosphere in London was that many band concerts were offered in the context of dance clubs. Beyond the cover charge to get into the UFO Club or Middle Earth or Sibylla's, the music was essentially free. A psychedelic gig by Pink Floyd at the Roundhouse in Camden then seemed like it offered the promise of a future revolutionary society where money was irrelevant and the goal of a cultural experience was to expand the mind. Pink Floyd's songwriter Syd Barrett was a good singles writer. Arnold Layne and C. Emily Play made the BBC pop charts, the latter reaching the top 10. However, Barrett soon became famous as the 60s' first acid casualty. His behavior became increasingly bizarre and unreliable. His friend, David Gilmour, was brought into the band as a second guitarist, but within weeks of Gilmour's arrival, the band asked Barrett to leave the group, by which time he was too stoned to be useful. He would later be revealed to be a schizophrenic. Yet the loss of the band's principal songwriter proved a blessing in disguise to the band, as the other members, particularly bassist Roger Waters, learned to write songs themselves, entirely changing the direction of the band. The rest of the band members were known not to take LSD themselves after Barrett's experience, a fact not nearly as ironic as it sounds. The audience atmosphere in which they performed inspired them to turn their backs on the singles market, choosing instead to concentrate on the sonic space they could define and expand at the UFO Club. Effectively, the audience of London hipsters for which they performed was inspiration enough for them to make a career out of catering to that audience's interests, and what they wanted was music to trip to. In 1967, it was not totally unheard of for a band to make its money primarily off concerts. But the idea of openly disdaining singles as opposed to allowing the market to determine one's commercial potential seemed radical indeed. We thought, okay, all right, See Emily Play was a nice single, but not the sort of thing a chap wants to play. So we wouldn't play it, and the audience threw beer and coins at us. We cleared more halls than you've had hot dinners, said Roger Waters. They instead played free concerts in Hyde Park, released a second album, A Saucer Full of Secrets, full of musical experiment with feedback, sustained notes, tape loops, and the like. The album was a series of conceptual pieces, atmospheric and spacey, and certainly not anything that could easily be described as rock and roll, because it was undanceable. Songs like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and Careful with That Axe, Eugene went on for more than 10 minutes apiece, amounting to a series of instrumental variations on a central theme, like classical pieces in concept, using rock instrumentation and rhythms to illustrate ideas in a fashion hardly different from that of the experimental art music of the day. The Soft Machine were the other major London club act identified early on as psychedelic rock. Formed in Canterbury, they played all the same clubs as Pink Floyd, the two bands often alternating as opening or closing acts. Songwriters Robert Wyatt and Kevin Ayers never had the skills to write pop singles, as had Syd Barrett. But this hardly mattered when they repeated poetic mantras on stage at clubs like Middle-earth and kept a motorcycle running in neutral next to the stage so they could rev its engine in the middle of a song. The idea of experimentation incorporated elements of jazz and classical music into their sets, and they began to move away from their earlier whimsical sound, like Pink Floyd, and become a more experimental group, toying with minimalism and modernist composition. They would later do without a guitarist in the band, perhaps the ultimate symbol of their divorce from the norm. The Incredible String Band was derived from the English folk music scene. They played traditional folk instruments, but also combined them with instruments and folk music styles from Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world. Guitar and violin player Robin Williamson met another guitarist and vocalist, Mike Heron, who had been banned from a club in Aberdeen for not singing folk songs in the traditionally approved manner. The two were like-minded in wanting to expand their audience's tastes to include world music as their form of psychedelic trip. Their second album, The 5,000 Spirits or the Layers of the Onion, and its follow-up, The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter from 1968, were romantic hippie masterpieces, full of odes to the countryside, vegetarianism, Scientology, a love of every living thing, the spirituality of nature, and the potential of psychedelics. They mined the same lyrical sources as British folk, especially in Welsh legends. The albums were packed with exotic instrumentation, especially from the North African sources Williamson had acquired during his journeys to Mexico. Their songs were often just plain weird. On their fourth album, Wee Tam and the Big Huge, Heron's song Douglas Treherne Harding described a man with no head, one eye, a body filled with light, and a home in a basement. They were anti-establishment, earthy yet spacey, exotic, obsessed with nature, oblique and weird, the embodiment of the psychedelic revolutionary ideal in Britain in every respect. In interviews, they often reinforced this status with their bizarre pronouncements on themselves and the state of the revolution as such. Revolutionists thinking you've got to fight something. Government isn't there to be fought, they're there to be educated. If anything, I'm the opposite of revolutionary, reactionary, evolutionary. I don't want to control people, that's not my trip, but I think there has to be some kind of government, and it has to be done by people individually. Maybe there has to be some kind of code which everyone will agree to. The way I'm approaching politics is by improving myself to a point where I don't need law. Many commentators, both youthful and adult, believe that this would be the moment at which class would be transcended, that age would replace youth as the greatest social division in Western society. Yet it was not noticed much at the time that the counterculture's loudest and most visible exponents were students, ex-students, and dropouts, a decidedly middle-class group, especially in Britain. In fact, the counterculture and its revolution through music really amounted to an extension of middle-class values to their extremes. Where the counterculture called for people to do their own thing, middle-class values emphasized individuality and self-expression. Where the middle classes reveled in a capitalist commodity culture, youth intellectuals built a psychedelic culture around the commodity of rock music. In other words, the young people of Britain in the 1960s and 1970s were themselves separated by tastes, class, work, their parents' work, the education system, gender, or race, and their own reactions to the British culture that surrounded them. Yet such did not seem noticeable to the youth revolutionaries of the day, caught up as they were in the excitement and impatience of the moment. The revolution was soon to arrive, and they had a front row seat and a great soundtrack to boot. This mindset thus led the evolution of psychedelic rock into a music identified by a new term, progressive rock, which was much more exclusive than the pop music played on the BBC and less dependent upon the experience of psychedelic drugs to get its ideas across to the listener. Progressive rock provided a very British moment in the history of rock music and youth culture, lasting from about the release of Sgt. Pepper and the Rise of the Psychedelic Bands to the December 1974 close of Radio 1's progressive program from 6 to 7 p.m. It was the beginning of the esteem of the British rock music as a romantic artist. Progressive rock was produced by an artistic elite, often educated at musical or art colleges, who capitalized on new technology, especially the synthesizer, to produce complicated soundscapes and separate their music from that of the teeny bopper pop audience, which was tainted by commerce and enslaved to monotonous dance rhythms. Progressive rock seemed the logical direction for many bands to turn to after the eclipse of the psychedelic era. It was highly experimental music, derived from free-form jazz, electronic compositions, American minimalism, the 18th century Baroque movement, and especially folk sources. All the better to convey the supposedly gentle and transformative experience of the acid trip through music, as opposed to actually dropping acid. Taking their cue from Sgt. Pepper, the progressive bands played up the music's romantic elements to the hilt, trying to infuse songs with poetry, instrumental virtuosity, elements from the jazz and classical traditions, and sometimes even from modern music experimenters like Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley. All of this came from the same impulse as the psychedelic, to make music into a sensual Gesamtkunstwerk, to transform the listener through the art they heard through their headphones. Many of the musicians themselves were from the public school Oxbridge set or studied at the Royal Academy of Music. Brought up in economically privileged backgrounds, much like the largest part of their audience, the musicians producing progressive rock believed the goal of transforming the listener was resolutely uncommercial, and the idea of an imminent revolution that would be brought about through progressive rock necessarily meant the death of capitalism. Commercialism was the very essence of a lack of revolutionary intent. Youth culture had never been as radical as it seemed in the 1960s in Britain. Class relations were broken down, with middle-class post-university kids calling for a working-class style revolution. Peer group and adult norms were opposed in favor of what was thought to be a strong individuality, even though there was a large amount of conformity in the new bohemian culture. There was also an implicit, never explicit, understanding that the relative strength of the capitalist adult world was exactly what made the bohemian counterculture possible. As a result, they had virtually none of the political significance that they aspired to. For whatever their preaching on the desire for revolution, virtually no well-known figure in the counterculture was willing to sell his incredible string band albums to get the money to buy weapons to overthrow the state. On the other hand, political commitment to the aims of the underground, or rather a demonstration of commitment, however feeble, was important for a band trying to make its way in the hip music scene of London in the late 60s and early 70s. A progressive band had to show that it was committed to the idea of rock revolution, a revolution that could not have started without rock music and whose message was spread the farthest by rock music as well. This situation frustrated many members of the student and London underground movements who wanted rock music to continue storming the shores of mass culture while they plotted the transformation of the society it represented behind the cultural front. A music reporter for International Times, Mark Williams, wrote an article called Pop Protest, designed to outline just these problems. Any art form, once it utilizes the techniques of product marketing and planning, ceases to be a recreation. It becomes a commercial culture and a media with all the concomitant communicative powers that are intrinsic to media. This power is either ignored or misused, and everyone in progressive rock ought to own up and evaluate the possibilities and then start using them in a constructive way. I want to see a band who can scream and shout about the dangerous thoughtlessness of the Great Gray Society, about the brutality of our cops and the stupidity of our laws. I want to see a group inciting a riot. I want to see some action. This summer is the time. The mood is right for us to fight politics with music in the same way the press and the telly can, but rarely do fight it, because rock is now a media. Sure, it's basically a recreation, a pastime for most people, but because we've now applied new rules to the way it's run, it's also a weapon. Let's use it. King Crimson's Robert Fripp was willing to play the countercultural game of promoting the revolution. In a letter to International Times, he tried to explain what he saw as the future of rock music, progressive rock music in particular. In it, he provided a virtual blueprint for the transformation of the original psychedelic underground ideal of music for the people into progressive rock, music for the arts. With the rise of the underground, there's been a growing concern with the attitudes expressed in and through the music. But what do we mean by underground? I think we expect underground to be synonymous with honesty, with seeking after a brave new world. The dissatisfaction of different people with conditions over a wide field of subjects, whether it is housing conditions in Notting Hill or the war in Vietnam, is seen in or composes the underground and is therefore mirrored in underground music. Could we perhaps say that the word underground is synonymous with the word improvement? If so, it would seem that true underground music is concerned with improvement. Perhaps by using the word underground, we are seeking to convey an attitude that much is wrong in this crappy world, but that we would like to do a little to put things right. Fripp went on to discuss the foolish use of the term commercial to describe bad music, making the point that music is not bad just because it sells. But the motivation and direction of progressive rock would lie in the words he used to describe improvement, and the idea of the commercial as bad would last for years to come. King Crimson themselves would be held up, rightly or wrongly, as pillars of the elitist conception of progressive rock as an art form far removed from the dictates of the marketplace. The development of a youth culture based around rock music inspired political exploration. Many young people were interested in a politics of youth that would carry the values they heard reflected in rock music into the avenues of power. For example, a British poet named Herbert Lomas proposed in the pages of International Times the creation of a new party, apparently and ironically not recognizing the fascist implications of the name in Britain. His goal was the workless society, an aristocratic society for everyone to be fully operative in the first 2 decades of the next century. He had numerous ideas for the development of such a party and its program. The creation of a society where machines did all the work. Quote, I'm assuming human beings will be intensely active and creative, pursuing self-realization because that's what human beings are like when they are free, as we can see from the glimpses we've had of some artists, creators, and aristocrats. He wanted to achieve this society through a flower revolution, a change in consciousness manifesting itself gradually in institutional changes, delivering a society of aristocrats out of the present bloody and constricted bourgeois womb. The new party would attract adherents to these ideals by getting itself elected to parliament. Members would join arts laboratories around the country as youth groups. They would get one new member elected to parliament. Quote, he's age 25 and he's got that slightly Schuberty, harmless intellectual look that John Lennon has. He has charm. Old ladies and young girls like him. He's the first of a bunch. Once they took over parliament, based on what they look like, of course, they would abandon the monetary system, build their machines, and live a life of thorough leisure like 18th century aristocrats. Lomas had no doubt as to where the money for all this would come from. Is there the money? Yes. The commercial interests, the pop clothes and music industries were the first to realize that most of the free money available nowadays was in the hands of the young, those people who had just started earning and haven't yet hostage themselves with the responsibilities and expense of marriage and family life. Hence the millionaires that have been made out of the record industry and fashion. Now, some of these millionaires can and would help. Many of them, the Beatles, say, Mary Quant, the Rolling Stones, are in powerful sympathy with the aims and attitudes of the new movement. No doubt they would be willing to contribute something to a serious and well thought out party aiming to realize the kind of society they themselves would enjoy. All of this theorizing about a future society brought about through youth revolution and reflecting youth values was not entirely intellectual. Besides the occasional development of communes and art labs, the ultimate example of the psychedelic trip leading to the creation of a revolutionary youth-based society was enacted on a temporary basis continually during the era. The Rock Festival. The Rock Festival was an excellent example of the link between psychedelics and the politics of the so-called youth revolution. The first major rock festival was the Monterey Pop Festival of June 1967, held in California, and numerous others followed all over the Western world. But significantly, the British came up with festivals of their own and festivals that lasted. Glastonbury, Nebworth, Reading, and the Isle of Wight were annual events, and Glastonbury and Reading are still going on today. And they spawned numerous other events which pursued the same values. Most of all, rock festivals, despite the assumption on the part of promoters that they were meant to make a profit, were hailed by the counterculture as repeated opportunities to put their ideas on the future progressive utopia into practice, despite the mud and sexual harassment that abounded at such events and the fact that the bathrooms were usually a mile away. A rock festival was meant to be a gathering of bands in an open, natural space in front of an audience imbued with the spirit of peace and love. This was youth community creating itself around the music, separating itself from the traditions of entertainment presentation. A rock festival was an opportunity to commune with nature and the youth community before rock artists who were worshipped as gods, to create instant cities whose rhetoric of peace and love would be, supposedly, translated into permanent practice. The festival brought numerous artists together in one place to play, maximizing one's entertainment pound. They were patronized by kids with plenty of money to spend who could afford to take several days off during the course of a working or schooling year and who were old enough and respectable enough not to be classed as either runaways or vagrants if they slept out of doors. The kids were usually college students who had the same desires their parents did when they visited holiday camps or took trips to the continent. They wanted to relax and enjoy themselves in surroundings that reflected their tastes, their values, and their affluence. There had long been similar events to the rock festival held by jazz and folk enthusiasts on a yearly basis, and several pop and rock and roll acts had shown up at them in the mid-60s. It was not long before the commercial potential of such festivals was recognized. In August 1967, just 2 months after Monterey Pop in the US, the Duke of Bedford hosted the Festival of the Flower Children at Woburn Abbey, his ancestral home. The acts were decidedly non-threatening and not psychedelic. The Bee Gees, the Small Faces, the Jeff Beck Group. Thousands of hippies showed up anyway to line the Duke's pockets with their gold at a cost of £1 for the entire weekend and 30 shillings for a single day. The Bedfords were hardly attuned to the values of the audience they had invited for the weekend, as attested to by the slightly shocked and bemused Duchess of Bedford, who declared, "I thought it was going to be a flower show with competitions, prizes, and lots of flowers." Woburn Abbey was taken, however, as a showcase for a new alternative society that saw psychedelic rock music as its standard bearer. Concerts began to be held in Hyde Park for free, where local bands and national acts like Pink Floyd, Traffic, Jethro Tull, Roy Harper, T-Rex, The Nice, and the Pretty Things would play to crowds of thousands to celebrate an anti-capitalist sub-society. The free concerts in Hyde Park were organized by Black Hill Enterprises, the managers of Pink Floyd. The same group was behind the development of the psychedelic clubs in London. To Black Hill's Peter Jenner, music was the vanguard of a movement to radically alter British society, to tear it from its industrial roots and give it back to a pastoral world where Little England would not have to worry itself with concepts of profit, class, and the like. The idea at the early free concerts was to share ideas and community. When the Rolling Stones wanted, excuse me, when the Rolling Stones wanted to play a free concert to commemorate the death of Brian Jones in July 1969, Jenner had an opportunity to spread these ideals even further to an audience far beyond that of the still underground psychedelic groups. The gathering for the Stones' free concert was the largest the park had seen since the days of the Chartist rallies of the 1840s. 500,000 people packed the park to hear Mick Jagger recite Shelley's Adonais and watch thousands of African butterflies, unaccustomed to the northern climate, fly out of boxes from which they were specially shipped from Africa to die within seconds. The death of the butterflies was prophetic. In an atmosphere where hundreds of thousands of people showed up to hear music, there were too many contradictions to create a real sense of community in the audience. The London alternative press turned with a vengeance on the Stones when they noticed that the band had never done anything to further the revolution. The Stones' failure to incite a riot was an irritant to an increasingly elitist progressive audience. Germaine Greer summarized the Stones' betrayal after the Hyde Park concert of 1969. What then is the mode of revolutionary music in October 1969? Why did Mick Jagger not tell those 250,000 people to take over the city? Why did they behave so well and pick up all their garbage? They were celebrating their togetherness, boasted the underground. They showed the parent generation how they were gentle and loving and cooperative. No one need be afraid of the Rolling Stones anymore. They couldn't change a thing. They didn't want to change a thing. The Stones aside, certain acts, like the Edgar Broughton Band, made their reputations at free concerts as acts dedicated to presenting their music for free and casting out the money changers from the alternative society's temple. Broughton became known for chanting, "Out, demons, out," from the stage, as if he could personally destroy the aura of profit at a festival. Broughton's band was really a glorified pub rhythm and blues band, but they became the toast of the underground press for their representation of the values of the Revolutionary Youth Society on the stage. Broughton dabbled in magic and the occult, and the three-piece band, guitar, bass, drums, based all of their stage shows and albums around the symbolism of a triangle. They used mime and magic rituals on stage as a part of their act and were thus accused by the mainstream music press of dabbling in the black arts, perfect to establish their psychedelic and progressive credentials. They were also known for their commitment to the revolution. At Hyde Park, they collected £100 to give to the London Street Commune, a group of squatters who had occupied the premises at 144 Piccadilly in summer 1969. Broughton himself was seen as a leader, a role he strenuously avoided accepting in fear that he would be selling out his communalist principles, saying, quote, "People just can't believe that we don't want to make a lot of money. Of course, we do want to make money. That's not our primary objective. And when we do make money, we want to do something with it, not just keep it for ourselves." And in the end, of course, he was accused of being a sellout because he actually needed to earn a living. Black Hill Enterprises began to charge £500 a concert for their gigs, an average sum for the day, and Peter Jenner was forced to defend Broughton to his critics. I think that Edgar pays his revolutionary dues. They're not denying the need for a revolution, but they've been burned too often by these bloody revolutionaries. Say Edgar's around with £5 million in the bank, and you go to him and say, "We need some bread to get so-and-so out of jail or to get some bombs," and he does nothing. Or even now, when he's only got £50 and you go around to him and he elbows you. Then you can criticize him, right? Some festivals were particularly successful, creating, as one promoter put it, a relaxed atmosphere of free tribes coming together. Glastonbury began in 1971 on Worthy Farm in Pilton, England, as a celebration of the summer solstice. Its parade of bands, free food and alcohol, and festive atmosphere prompted one reviewer to call it part of a progression that must lead to a permanent rural community. The time for planning the festival where you don't have to go home is now. It was followed by a festival at Reading to commemorate the town's 1100th year of existence, which also went down relatively well despite police harassment. The rock festival represented the actual alternative that youth culture was aiming to create: pastoral, musical, peaceful, spiritual, erotic, psychedelic. The atmosphere at a festival was greater than the music itself, far above the message of any band on the stage. It would seem that the difference between a concert and a rock festival is that you watch a concert while you actually take part in a festival. And the feeling of being part of such a large body of people with a common interest and even many common ideas is as much an attraction as the rock and roll bands. The festival requires such a degree of participation from the audience that it supersedes the idea of just a large gathering to hear music. Of course, every festival was organized with the notion of profit in mind. Whereas young British teenagers in the 70s would go to a festival expecting to recreate a form of alternative society with a rock and roll soundtrack over the course of a weekend, outside of Hyde Park, they usually had to pay several pounds for the privilege. One of the most expensive was the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival, which was famously overcrowded and muddy with a horrible sound system to boot. Some fans actually left the stadium to climb into trees outside to watch the concert, which turned out to be a better place to both see and hear the bands for free. Thousands of people left early before Jimi Hendrix closed the concert, and a contingent of French anarchists made themselves a nuisance by tearing down fences and smashing shop windows nearby. So much for community. By 1971, the festival spirit was already in decline. Promoters had hoped to reap large profits off the combination of multiple big-name acts to bring in a huge audience. Audiences had hoped to build their ultimate romantic youth community in the sun and grass. focused around the music that made it all possible. Neither were successful. A later festival was so bad that one writer suggested the appointment of a people's committee to be certain that the needs of 500,000 festival goers would be accommodated. Establishment dislike of the festivals meant that they met with more and more police and state interference. Most authorities were terrified of the spectacle of huge gatherings of young people in open mockery and rebellion against the values of the affluent adult community. The public mind tended to associate pop music festivals with political rallies, demonstrations, protest marches, and the like, and they disliked them heartily. One man suggested in a local newspaper that the 1969 Isle of Wight Festival was calculated to overthrow Anglo-Saxon civilization. On top of this, many festival organizers were either incompetent, untrustworthy, or both. Gradually, the rock festival dwindled down to the two permanent major festivals still held in Britain today, Glastonbury and Reading, both of which were put on to bring in massive profits. In fact, the entire enterprise of establishing the alternative youth society around progressive rock and its values was already in decline by 1971 and 1972. Progressive rock bands from the psychedelic era forward, Pink Floyd, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, were far more interested in musical experimentation than they were in their roles as vanguards of a revolutionary youth culture. Progressive rock was essentially progressing past the point of rebellion, adopting many of the values of the bourgeois lifestyles its musicians were raised in, and seemingly less and less relevant to the crumbling edifice of the 1970s economic and cultural order that had been just a few short years before. A Sounds interviewer, Steve Peacock, tried to sum up these changes. In the 60s, rock began to liberate itself from the strings of the mighty business control. It began to set a lifestyle that affected thousands, millions of people, and because of the way it had been held down in the past, with rock and roll stars being little more than glossy consumer products, it was necessary at that time for rock musicians to establish themselves as musicians. But that has been done now. It is now possible for people to be successful by doing what they want to do. The trouble is, where do we go from here? Rock seems to have reached a crisis point that has faced various forms of art again and again. Having reached a certain stage of liberation within its own development, how does it apply that liberation in a wider context? The question is not who is going to be the next superstar, but how do we use what we have already achieved? Some counterculture journalists simply could not let go of the vision of an alternative society that they saw before them in the music and in the festivals. One Jody Breslaw was given several pages in International Times in 1971 to put his vision of the future youth utopia into print. The building of a new society, the forging of communal unity, the triumph of love in human relations, the liberation of individual expression, the elevation of spiritual consciousness, the radical transformation of man, the glorious dawning of a new era. This is an expression of what might be called the apocalyptic vision, and it is one of the main currents in rock music. As a form of popular entertainment, rock represents something of a departure in voicing this theme. The infusion of Eastern religious thought into the counterculture and of drugs, particularly the psychedelics, introduced a spiritual and philosophical element to apocalyptic consciousness. Inner experience was brought into focus, and new awareness was to allow for transcending petty material bonds. Rock has continued to work both sides of this fence, revolution in society and revolution inside your head. Either way, it sounds the death knell for the old reality and rings in the new. The tendency toward expression of extreme emotions, toward testing the limits of human experience, is combined with the faith in technology, which is, after all, central to electrified rock, to produce the energy trip. A good portion of rock music aspires to take its audience over the top, into an entirely different realm of liberating experience. High energy is employed to burn out the fuse fuses of inhibiting mechanisms to free the imprisoned soul of the youth culture. In this sense, rock seeks not only to describe, but to create the apocalypse, to make it all happen. Breslau, a music critic, was a true believer in the concept of psychedelic and progressive rock as a medium for a revolution of the mind. He also made the rather poor assumption that the musicians that he preached about shared his vision. It did not take long for him to be disabused of that notion. A few months after his International Times article came out, he conducted an interview with Pink Floyd for Rock magazine that exposed all of the pretension and bombast of the counterculture's efforts to turn the commercial medium of rock music into a vehicle for the transformation of society. Jody Breslau. On your first album and several cuts on relics dating from the same period, the prevailing tone seems to be a kind of mad humor, a surreal social satire which nonetheless relates to the world as we know it. Then, on Saucerful of Secrets and Ummagumma, the whole space metaphor takes over, a mystical expression of other consciousness, of psychic and spiritual exploration, etc. What about that change? Pink Floyd. Just a transfer of focus when Sid Barrett, the original guiding force of the group, left. We never consciously set out to do that. Let's get cosmic and all that. Jody Breslau. But didn't you have any thought about what the whole space metaphor meant for you? It's hardly a coincidence that it suddenly became so important in your music. I mean, the space exploration metaphor fits in a certain way. The charismatic relationship to the audience with you as the pilot and so on. Pink Floyd. It's nothing intellectual, really. All it is a manifestation of us responding to the sounds we make, much in the same way that you would. We just set out to make a piece of music. Right, Saucerful of Secrets was written first, then we came up with a title. We didn't plan it out. We all were very much into science fiction. It gave us material for the songs, good subjects. Jody Breslau. But it isn't really the subject matter so much, the words of the songs. Ummagumma seems so heavily into a different consciousness, a very alien state. General laughter. It's like getting lost in the universe. For me, it has no bearing on worldly affairs, day-to-day human lives. Pink Floyd. Look, there is no fucking sound in space. It doesn't make any noise. Actually, the sound is more like caves, large buildings. Jody Breslau. I won't pursue the space exploration parallels since you all seem so sensitive about it. But one gets a feeling from Saucerful and a very deliberate mind-bending, consciousness stretching, etc. Does it tie in with the psychedelic thing? Was there any particular axe to grind? What was the thrust? Any number of the counterculture's journalists and critics considered themselves communists of one sort or another, essentially because communism equated in the British mind with the idea of a revolution and of a future utopia of equality that would undermine their parents' world. They thus shared a vision with that of E.P. Thompson, Richard Hogarth, and Raymond Williams, all of them prominent Marxist intellectuals in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. Instead, the Marxists despised popular culture, particularly in Britain, because they saw it as a tool to de-intellectualize the masses. And nothing was worse in this fashion than rock and roll and rock music. They saw it as a distraction to the effort to bring about a just society, a new religion that killed the energies of the working classes by channeling it into a new direction, less harmful to the perpetuation of a bourgeois state. They also hated the fact that popular culture often displayed the vulgarity of the working classes for all to see, and no media made this more obvious than that horrible American import, rock and roll. Both Hogarth and Williams emphasized that any culture based in modern technology was not capable of supplying the cultural needs of the masses. As good Marxists, they saw rock music as alienation, the reduction of man to a mindless functionalism that would result in his own loss of humanity. Mass culture in general was, to the Marxist, a soporific drug that reduced someone like Jody Breslau to intellectualizing about art that wasn't real. Rather, Marxist critics tended to look nostalgically backward to an era where community was organic, when the production of culture and work were a part of the same process, a part of living itself such that culture could not be bought, like a record, any more than labor could or should be bought. The politics of the youth revolution was a failure ultimately because the intellectuals who defined the revolution were too esoteric in their visions to make the revolution happen, and the musicians they wanted to champion the revolution did not care enough. With the nation in the economic quagmire of 1973 and 74, an election loomed in February 1974 that received no enthusiasm whatsoever from the general public. Melody Maker polled a number of rock musicians for their opinions on the coming elections and their political attitudes in general. Most declared they were not going to vote, had little idea about the issues, disliked the ongoing miners' strike, and seemed inclined to vote liberal simply because the liberals were not one of the two other parties. The anonymous pollster was obviously a bit surprised and maybe a little disgusted with these results when it turned out he had no article to publish. With the country languishing in the political and economic doldrums, we thought it might be educative to test the political feelings of rock and jazz musicians. After all, rock in the 60s was supposed to be an instrument of revolution, though how little true that is in the 70s leads one to think it may have been faddism. Where are all the sloganizing politicos of yesteryear? By and large, it would seem that rock musicians are quite political animals. At any rate, none of them have any desire to up arms and bring down the establishment, nor was there any real alignment of ideas with the communistic factors in the miners' union. Although none of them declared they would vote conservative, few of them appeared to entertain thoughts of uniting their fans behind any political party, or to emphasize the validity or otherwise of voting. So ultimately, the youth political revolution, ill-conceived and badly led, died a death. Just because a political revolution did not occur, however, did not mean there was no revolution whatsoever. Rock music in Britain at the time served as a mirror of social, cultural, and economic values, and certain aspects of those values were in the process of overturning in Britain with the same rapidity that the best bands of the era churned out new albums. In other words, if a revolution amounts to fast change, a carefully defined series of fast changes were taking place in Britain in the later 1960s and early 1970s, just not politically, where everyone was focused. The experience of psychedelic drugs, the resulting opening of minds and expansion of consciousness, the perceived colors and sounds and experiences in the effort to establish temporary alternative societies in the form of festivals amounted to a revolution in culture, as reflected in the rock music of the time. Psychedelic and progressive rock did not immediately change the way people thought about social divisions, but it did appeal to people across class lines, racial lines, gender lines, and other sociocultural divides. In it lay the seed for changes to flower and grow in the decades following in a way that was accepted and studied and expanded upon that no other cultural medium of the 1960s could match. Eventually, the actual revolution occurred in British culture in its psychedelic-inspired emphasis on revamped romantic values that would prove marketable and translatable to the rest of the world. Psychedelic rock and its successor, progressive rock, made British music culture permanently exportable in the latter part of the 20th century and turned what had once been the land without music, as the Germans mockingly referred to it, into the world's second major source of popular music culture to the United States, a cultural revolution if ever there was one. And irony of ironies, most of the values that went into this revolution were as old as Romantic culture in Britain, dating all the way back to the era of the Industrial Revolution. Thank you. I'm sorry if I went a little bit over.
Thank you, David. Great, that's great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bom, agora vamos passar para as perguntas. Lívia.
Oh, I can't hear you, Libya.
Sorry. We're going to start with the questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
That's great.
So first,
did I go long? It was about an hour, I guess. Was that what it's supposed to be?
Perfect. Don't worry about it.
All right.
So first I'll read them in Portuguese, then I'll read them in English, okay?
Okay.
Então, a primeira pergunta é do José César Gomes. Muito obrigada pela brilhante fala. Você termina a palestra apontando para a ironia da revolução, premiada por valores românticos. Outra ironia também poderia ser apontada na forma musical do rock progressivo, recheada de elementos barrocos. É possível dizer que a revolução pretendida era de uma volta ao passado? Uma espécie de revolução conservadora? Ou seria exagero dizer isso? Thank you for the great talk. You end the lecture by pointing out the irony of revolution permeated by romantic values. Another irony could also be pointed out in the musical form of progressive rock, full of baroque elements. Is it possible to say that the intended revolution was a return to the past, a kind of conservative revolution, or would that be an exaggeration?
The simple answer in short sentences is yes.
A resposta simples, em frases curtas, é que sim.
A lot of my research beyond this paper has been on the connection between rock music and older artistic and cultural trends in European history.
Então, muito da pesquisa dele, além dessa que ele apresentou hoje, tem se voltado ao rock e... Could you repeat the end, please?
Has been on the connection between rock music in Britain and its connection to older and more established artistic and cultural trends.
A relação do rock na Inglaterra, no Reino Unido, aliás, e outros estilos e áreas da arte mais bem estabelecidas.
Probably the most important of those connections is to the values of romanticism, particularly from British poets, artists, sculptors, novelists.
Provavelmente o mais importante são os trabalhos do romantismo, como o de poetas, artistas, novelistas, entre outros.
What I see as really important in that.
O que ele realmente entende como sendo mais importante nisso
is that it made these values that, you know, in the case of this paper, but also in the terms of my book, it made the values that were being presented to the British public familiar.
Desses valores que ele apresenta não só nessa palestra, mas também no livro dele, é que esses valores, could you repeat the end, please?
It made the values that young people were trying to present through rock music familiar to them. They had experienced it before.
Fez com que os valores dessa experiência, os valores apontados por esses jovens fossem realmente apontados por eles, né? Como em especial no rock.
In terms of this work, in terms of this idea of revolution,
temos essa ideia de revolução,
kind of the irony of it,
meio que a ironia disso,
like you recognize,
como você reconhece,
is that they were trying to bring about a revolution in values that would take people back to like the pre-industrial era.
Eles estavam tentando chamar atenção para uma revolução que que na verdade data tem conexão e data com antes dos anos da era pré-revolução, pré-industrial, perdão.
Yeah. Does that answer the question? Is that?
Thank you.
Agora uma pergunta do professor José Adriano Federic. Gostaria de agradecê-lo pela fala e por seu trabalho e que tanto contribui com os estudos de nosso grupo. No White Album dos Beatles, de 1968, existem duas músicas denominadas Revolution, a Revolution e a Revolution 9. Uma delas, do ponto de vista musical, é bem tradicional, embora tenha uma letra mais engajada. Já a outra, Revolution 9, é um experimento mais vanguardista do ponto de vista musical. É possível dizer que essas duas revolutions expressavam as contradições e impasses do período, a revolução social versus a revolução artística, e que essas duas revoluções nunca conseguiram se articular devidamente no rock. So, on the Beatles' 1968 White Album, there are two songs called Revolution and Revolution 9. One of them, from a musical point of view, is quite traditional, although it has more politically engaged lyrics. The other, Revolution 9, is a more avant-garde experiment from a musical point of view. Is it possible to say that these two revolutions express the contradictions and impasses of the period, the social revolution versus the artistic revolution, and that these two revolutions were never properly articulated in rock music? Thank you very much for your talk.
Well, first of all, the first thing is I have a book for the question person.
Primeiro de tudo, ele tem livro que trata sobre isso.
I don't know if you've done it in the class, but it is Ian MacDonald's Revolution in the Head.
Ele não sabe se você já tratou disso em aula, mas se chama Ian MacDonald's Revolution in the Head.
Have you read it?
Você já leu?
Yes.
You guys have done that book? Okay,
yes.
Yeah. That book is, to me, the best book ever written on the Beatles, and frankly, I think the best book ever written on, like pretty much the best book ever written on rock music in Britain.
Para ele, esse é o melhor livro já escrito sobre os Beatles e principalmente o melhor livro já escrito sobre a música, sobre o rock no Reino Unido.
And he, very much addresses that in the book.
E ele destaca muito bem isso no livro.
Revolution, one of the interesting things, I'm pretty sure it's MacDonald that says this. One of the interesting things about Revolution, the song, the first song, the traditional song, is that John Lennon could not decide until the last minute whether or not to sing that if you want to bring about destruction, you can count me in or count me out.
May I translate? Sorry. E uma das coisas que ele acha interessante é que, e que são apontadas no livro, é que o John Lennon não sabia desde o princípio, e ele está se tratando aqui da música Revolution original, se ele deveria cantar. Could you repeat? He would sing.
Count me in or count me out.
In or count me out.
Right. Count me in or count me out. Yes. Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty sure that's in the MacDonald book where he talks about that.
Ele tem praticamente certeza que está nesse livro.
What I think is really interesting about those two songs in terms of discussing psychedelic rock and the concept of revolution, particularly Revolution 9.
E o que ele acha que é o mais interessante se destacar no rock psicodélico, especialmente nessas duas músicas, Revolution e Revolution 9,
is the influence of these experimental composers that the Beatles were listening to in that time, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Terry Riley, stuff like that.
Especialmente os compositores que os Beatles, compositores experimentais que os Beatles estavam escutando naquela época, como Could you repeat their name, please?
Stockhausen, Terry Riley.
Stockhausen, Teg Riley, yes.
That these they were, and for that matter, Yoko Ono.
E por conta disso, a Yoko Ono.
That Lennon had met Yoko Ono, and she had a big influence on his artistic development.
E quando o John conheceu Yoko Ono, ela teve uma grande influência no estilo artístico dele.
And in terms of, the paper we just did, that to me is actually, and I assume this is what the question asker means. That to me is where the actual revolution represented in psychedelic rock and progressive rock came from.
E para ele,
all of those, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. E para ele, principalmente no que se diz respeito ao texto que ele acabou de apresentar agora, essa influência que o rock, a música do rock psicodélico tem.
Just being short, that it's more cultural than it is political.
Que é muito mais cultural do que é política.
Thank you, Dave.
A próxima pergunta é da Vanessa Pironato.
Só um minutinho, Lívia. Só para agradecer e dizer que tem uma orientanda que ficou muito contente com a resposta dele, a Vanessa.
He would like to thank you, and there is a student who was very pleased with your answer, and she actually asks the next question.
Okay.
Da Vanessa Pironato, Steve Peacock afirmou que o rock parece ter atingido um ponto de crise que várias formas de arte enfrentaram repetidamente. O declínio do rock como ponta de lança da revolução tem ligação com essa crise das formas pela qual o rock passou? O fim da contracultura também não contribui para que eles cessassem o desenvolvimento do material musical que tinham criado até então? So, thank you for the amazing talk. Steve Peacock stated, rock seems to have reached a crisis point the various art forms have faced repeatedly. Does the decline of rock as a spearhead of revolution have a connection to this crisis the rock genre has gone through? Did the end of the counterculture also contribute to them seizing the development of the musical material they had created until then?
Can you repeat that? Let me make sure that I have the question right. Is the person asking the question talking about a crisis in rock music right now?
I suppose it's the crisis the rock genre has gone through, so from one starting point in the past to the present.
Okay, all right. And then, I'm sorry, follow through on the rest of it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I will repeat this. And does the decline of rock as a spearhead of revolution have a connection to this crisis the rock genre has gone through? Did the end of the counterculture also contribute to them seizing the development of the musical material they had created until then?
Did the end of the counterculture contribute to them seizing the material? I'm trying to figure out what.
I believe what the question is trying to. It's there's a crisis. We see a crisis between 1969 and the early 70s. Yeah. Like the experimentation of the musical material. It's not that strong. It's not the market closes, and the market doesn't allow it to be that experimental, and the bands perhaps are not that interested in it. But the experimentation, it's confined. It seems like it's confined to the 1960s. Maybe the question is on that line.
Yeah. Does that sound right to the questioner? Can you ask them?
Let's see. I think that's about it. That's about it.
So basically, the idea being that as this period is closing, the music is becoming more, in the early 70s, is becoming more less experimental.
A música dos anos 70 está se tornando cada vez menos experimental, ou saindo da cena principal.
More comfortable to the average listener.
E mais confortável para o ouvinte médio.
And this isn't a part of the question, but I'm assuming that this is what the questioner is getting at.
Ele sabe que isso não é parte da pergunta. Ele sabe que não é parte da pergunta, mas ele assume que seja nessa direção que a pessoa que está perguntando está se direcionando.
It makes it seem almost as if punk is necessary.
Faz parecer com que o punk seja necessário.
Is that what they're getting at?
É isso que ele está pensando? Que a Vanessa está pensando?
I believe so. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, a couple things.
Duas coisas.
One, I would say that it is not completely correct.
Ele diria que não é completamente correto.
The 70s was
dizer que a música do começo dos anos 70
was mainstream, boring, and tame, I guess.
Que ela era parada, que ela era já tinha sido utilizado muito dela, não tinha mais o que explorar, que ela tinha saído do mainstream e se tornado chata.
Because, especially when you're talking about the counterculture, which the question brings up, there actually is a musical underground that's progressive in the early 70s. Bands like Can, Gong, actually Soft Machine breaks up into a couple of different groups that are very experimental and working in like modern jazz with classical themes. I would throw Curved Air out there as another example. A lot of folk groups. I should shorten this answer. Let me shorten the answer first.
Please, so I can translate.
Yeah, right. There are actually a lot of very experimental progressive acts in the early 1970s.
No início dos anos 70 existem vários cenários de rock progressivo.
However, the question is correct in noting that nobody knows who they are.
A questão está correta ao dizer que ninguém sabe quem eles são.
These actually became, when the questioner was asking about the counterculture, these became the counterculture's bands. The counterculture itself became underground and artistic, cultural, as opposed to political.
Ok. Assim como foi perguntado, essas bandas se tornaram as músicas as bandas da contracultura. E could you repeat the end, please?
The counterculture, the listeners to these more underground progressive bands.
E o ouvinte dessas músicas mais progressivas, da contracultura,
they were, say, the brothers and sisters of the people that I was talking about in this paper.
eles são o que se
They were
diz,
more artistically and culturally oriented than politically oriented.
eles são como os irmãos e as irmãs das pessoas com as quais ele se refere nessa apresentação dele hoje. And could you repeat the end, please?
They were more artistically and culturally oriented
Eles
than
eram mais
the earlier.
direcionados ao conceito artístico do que político.
Therefore, when punk arose,
E, portanto, quanto os punk rose,
a lot of these kids became members of punk bands like the Stranglers, Subway Sect, Gang of Four. That was the new counterculture.
e muitos desses jovens se tornaram parte dessas bandas. Could you repeat the bands, please?
Subway Sect,
Subway Sect,
Stranglers,
Stranglers,
Gang of Four.
Gang of Four.
These were, they were different than the Clash and the Sex Pistols.
Eles eram diferentes do Clash, dos Sex Pistols.
In that they were the same university kids at art schools as the progressive bands of the 1960s and 70s.
Eles eram os mesmos jovens das escolas de arte dos anos 60 e 70.
They derived from those places.
Eles se derivaram desses lugares.
So the question, in terms of bands like Yes, or Emerson, Lake and Palmer,
Em termos de bandas como Yes e Emerson, Lake and Palmer,
it's true that those bands became mainstream and effectively tame as far as, when you're talking about the death of rock in that period. It's true.
É verdade que elas se tornaram essencialmente calmas, mais tranquilas e could you repeat the end, please? They became essentially tame and
effectively the idea for the average listener that rock and roll was tame, it was true.
E aí, essencialmente, a ideia de que o rock and roll estava domado era verdade.
But the issue is who the listener is.
Mas a questão é quem é o ouvinte e como ele se interessa.
Does that answer the question?
Thank you. One more question.
Yeah, one more question. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. As many as you want.
Então, do Felipe Ferraz, obrigado pela palestra, pensando a trajetória do rock nos anos 1970 e 1980, do rock progressivo ao heavy metal, como podemos avaliar o desenvolvimento do gênero em termos políticos? Foi mais progressista ou mais conservador? Thank you for the lecture. Reflecting on the trajectory of rock in the 1970s and 1980s, from progressive rock to heavy metal, how can we assess the development of the genre in political terms? Was it more progressive or more conservative?
Wow. The knee-jerk answer is that heavy metal is conservative.
A resposta é que o heavy metal por si só é bastante conservador.
But I'm inclined to dig a little deeper.
Mas ele gostaria de cavar um pouco mais fundo.
That particularly bands like Motorhead,
Bandas como Motorhead,
Black Sabbath, as opposed to Ozzy Osbourne,
Black Sabbath, como se opõe ao Ozzy Osbourne?
Are those bands are influenced by progressive rock.
Essas bandas são influenciadas pelo rock progressivo.
And I think that they have a very similar cultural outlook.
E elas têm um olhar um pouco mais progressivo.
By cultural outlook, I mean like, the sort of, surface level revolution that I was talking about in the paper.
E com esse olhar progressivo ele quer dizer um pouco mais na superfície esses termos que ele abordou na palestra dele.
Sim.
But the trend, I think, is toward the conservative. And actually, the trend is also toward crossing the Atlantic.
Mas a corrente é, na verdade, na direção do conservadorismo e atravessando o Atlântico.
Which also is the case with progressive rock itself, with bands like Styx.
E também é o caso de bandas de rock progressivo como The Styx.
That when Americans adopt progressive rock, when Americans adopt heavy metal, there is a complete abandonment of any of the rhetoric of revolution.
Quando os americanos adotam as bandas de rock progressivo e when bands adopt the bands of progressive rock and
that they just abandon the rhetoric of revolution.
Eles abandonam essa retórica de revolução que eles adotavam até aí.
Does that answer the question? I think that's my opinion. I haven't done a ton of research on it, but that is, based upon, what I know that I would give out.
Essa é a opinião dele, ele não fez muita pesquisa sobre isso, mas é basicamente o que ele acha.
Basically, I don't want to sound like an expert on it.
Ele não quer só como um expert nisso. We have got one more question. Thank you, da Vanessa Pironato, de novo. Thank you for, você poderia desenvolver um pouco mais a relação entre o rock dos anos 60 e o modernismo? Thank you for the amazing talk. Could you elaborate a little more on the relationship between 1960s rock and modernism?
I actually find that where you'll really find modernism, as in like futurism, fauvism.
Onde você encontra o modernismo como fauvismo, futurismo, cubismo.
Where you'll really find the influence of those movements is actually in post-punk bands like Susie and the Banshees.
Onde você realmente encontra a influência desses estilos uma banda como... Could you repeat the name of the band?
Susie and the Banshees.
Silks.
Magazine is another band similar.
Magazine é outra banda parecida.
It's hard to say that modernism is particularly influential on progressive rock.
É difícil dizer que o modernismo realmente influencia no rock moderno.
In non-musical terms.
Em termos não musicais.
In actual, I'm not a musicologist, I'm a historian.
Ele enfatiza que ele não é um musicologista, um musicólogo, aliás. Ele é só um historiador.
But my understanding is that listening to the kind of composers that influenced progressive musicians, that those composers themselves would be referred to as modernists.
Mas ele entende que ao escutar esses autores, esses compositores, que na verdade são inspirados nessas correntes artísticas.
Yeah, off the top of my head, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, that they would have been influential on a lot of progressive musicians. Schoenberg.
Eles seriam influentes em vários músicos como Chamber.
Which you can hear in the music in certain cases.
Que você pode perceber na música em alguns momentos.
I'm trying to remember the composer's name.
Ele está tentando lembrar o nome dos compositores.
John Cage?
No. It's the guy who influenced Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
O cara que influenciou Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Prokofiev.
Yeah.
Prokofiev,
that's right. Yeah, that's him. Right.
Isso, ele mesmo.
That kind of modernism.
Esse tipo de modernismo.
But when you're talking about it, a full aesthetic.
Mas quando você está falando de toda a estética.
The sort of stuff that we've been talking about in this paper.
It's
much more post-punk new wave than it is progressive.
De todas as coisas que a gente está falando nesse documento, é muito mais essa nova onda do post-punk, do new wave.
Eu queria fazer mais uma pergunta aqui. I would like to ask another question, if possible. Sure. We were talking about just now. You were talking about progressive rock, but thinking about rock itself from the 60s, there is it's the 60s modern approaches, like they have influences from Stockhausen on. So that's what I would like to ask. The rock from the 60s, they are closer to this modern approach to art.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have to translate to português. O que eu perguntei para ele é que o rock dos anos... A gente estava falando sobre o progressivo, né? Agora eu perguntei para ele se o rock dos anos 60 é mais próximo dessas técnicas modernistas, tem essas influências modernas da arte.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Postmodern composers.
Pós-moderno. Yeah. Compositores pós-modernos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A gente tem... Thank you. A gente tem mais perguntas?
Tem mais uma.
Okay.
We have one last question. Do Marco Abrão Conte. Eu gostaria de agradecê-lo pela sua participação no evento e por sua contribuição. Professor Simonelli, quando você fala que os marxistas desprezavam a cultura popular e o rock, quais marxistas eram esses? Os da nova esquerda, como Williams e Hogarth, ou os marxistas mais tradicionais? Ou ambos? Professor Simonelli, when you say that Marxists despised popular culture and rock music, which Marxists were they? Those of the new left, like Williams and Hogarth, or the more traditional Marxists? Or both? Thank you for the lecture.
Well, I guess I would say both.
Ele acha que ele diria os dois.
The person that I'm thinking of in particular is actually the German writer Theodor Adorno.
Uma pessoa na qual ele está pensando em especial é o Theodor Adorno.
I should define what it is that they hated about pop music and mass culture in general.
O que ele acha que ele deveria definir antes, o que eles achavam sobre a cultura pop e o rock em geral.
Yeah. Williams, Hogarth, Thompson, and the like wanted to see, and this was a concept the BBC picked up too, what they wanted was what they called a common culture as opposed to a mass culture.
O que esses autores queriam ver era uma cultura. They wanted to see a culture that was
Common was their
comum,
term for
ao
it,
invés
as
de
opposed to mass.
uma cultura de massa.
Largely, the difference would be in how it was marketed.
A diferença seria em como ela foi comercializada.
Marxists had a sense that, both like your writers in, the Germans who migrated here to the United States after the Second World War, and the writers of the New Left in Britain. Both of them had a sense that mass culture was stupefying the working classes.
Could you repeat, please?
Marxists basically thought that mass culture was stupefying the working classes. It was making them dumb.
Então, essencialmente, os marxistas acreditavam que essa cultura pop estava deixando a população mais burra.
Rather, what they wanted to celebrate would be what we considered folk culture.
O que eles queriam celebrar era o que a gente considera de cultura folk.
But they wanted it to emanate spontaneously from the working classes and be accepted without it becoming commercial.
Eles queriam que isso surgisse da população trabalhadora e não que fosse uma coisa estabelecida pelos outros.
So, for example, skiffle in the 1950s.
Então, por exemplo, o skiffle em
would be an
1950
absolutely perfect example of folk culture
seria um exemplo perfeito de cultura folk,
that they presumably would like.
que eles presumivelmente gostariam.
But then it becomes popular and kids buy the records, and that's the end of that.
Mas aí eles se tornaram populares, as crianças começaram a comprar os discos e foi aí o fim.
I want to strongly emphasize that the Marxists are outrageous hypocrites for complaining about this.
Ele gostaria de enfatizar que os marxistas foram bastante hipócritas ao reclamar disso.
Yeah. As with most Marxists that I've known, and in particular British Marxists, they are more interested in listening to themselves talk than getting to know the working classes, which they're famous for.
Ele diz que os marxistas que ele conhece, em especial os marxistas britânicos, estão muito mais felizes em ouvir eles mesmos falarem do que realmente o povo.
So don't think that they're onto something.
Então não pense que eles estão preocupados com alguma coisa. Ok, one more question. Do Ricardo Arruda, muito obrigado pela sua leitura. Em 20 de setembro de 1968, foi lançado um texto no International Times, escrito por Emmanuel Petrakis, em que ele afirmava que o underground deveria criar um banco para financiar o modo de vida do underground. Instituições bancárias são uma das expressões da vida moderna. Seria um exagero afirmar que esse tipo de proposta era contraditória ao estilo de vida romântico proposto pelo rock e pelo underground. On September 20, 1968, a text was published in the International Times, written by Emmanuel Petrakis, in which he argued that the underground should create a bank to finance the underground way of life. Yeah. Banking institutions are one of the expressions of modern life. would it be an exaggeration to say that this kind of proposal was contradictory to the romantic lifestyle advocated by rock and the underground?
It was this was actually something I was talking about in the paper along the way.
Isso era uma coisa que ele estava falando no decorrer da palestra.
And I mentioned it as being implicit as opposed to explicit.
E ele menciona como algo implícito ao invés de explícito.
That the counterculture never talked about it, but there was an assumption that the creation of their ideal society would be built on the backs of the financial security that they got from their parents.
Uma ideia de que a contracultura seria construída nas costas da segurança financeira que eles tinham com os pais deles.
I think I read that article.
Acho que ele leu esse artigo.
Back when I was working on my book.
Quando ele estava trabalhando no livro dele.
It is very typical of them
Muito típico deles.
To contradict their own values.
Contradizer os próprios valores.
In order to bring about the longer term goal.
Para trazer esses objetivos a longo prazo.
Effectively, you would want to set up that bank so that someday you could live in a cashless society.
Efetivamente, você gostaria desse banco para que, de alguma forma, algum dia você viva numa sociedade sem dinheiro.
And you can bet that they thought they were going to get the music from John Lennon and Mick Jagger.
E você pode acreditar que eles achavam que iam conseguir a música de Mick Jagger e John
Lennon. They would get the money.
E assim eles conseguiriam o dinheiro.
Eu acho que
se eu perguntar se ele não está cansado, né?
Sim.
Talvez a última, assim, se for o caso.
One last question, Professor Simonelli.
Sure.
Pergunta se ele está cansado.
We're wondering if you're tired.
Oh, no, I'm okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm okay. I got my glass of water. Everything is fine.
Understandable. Do André Pimenta, brilhante leitura, a que você atribui um sucesso maior, tanto de público quanto de mercado, das bandas psicodélicas inglesas, tendo em vista que a indústria cultural norte-americana sempre foi a mais potente. Podemos dizer que os anos 60 foram um teste do mercado para que as empresas norte-americanas permitiram que ocorresse em terras inglesas, para depois depurar o aspecto revolucionário do que havia sido feito e produzir mercadorias kitsch. Brilliant lecture. To what do you attribute the greater success, both in terms of the public and the market, of English psychedelic bands, given that the North American culture industry has always been the most powerful? Can we say that the 1960s were a market test that US companies allowed to take place in England, and then removed the revolutionary aspect of what had been done and produced kitsch merchandise?
Do I have the question right, that you're asking whether the influence of American marketing made it so that British rock music sold around the world? Is that right? Is that what the question is?
I think so, yes.
Because they were talking about kitsch marketing and all, and I'm not sure that I have it right.
As a consequence, they had kitsch merchandise.
Okay, yeah. In my research beyond this paper, my sense is that what made British rock music marketable,
o que tornou a música britânica vendável,
were two things.
Foram duas coisas.
Both of them in psychedelic rock in particular.
Ambas no rock psicodélico, em particular.
That familiarity with romantic culture.
Que a familiaridade com a cultura romântica.
In other words, it was a culture that everybody was familiar with.
Em outras palavras, uma cultura que as outras pessoas estavam familiarizadas.
And the influence of the empire on the
Influência do império.
in the 60s.
And the influence of the empire in the
on the music of the 60s, particularly psychedelic rock.
Na música dos anos 60, em especial do rock psicodélico.
Frankly, if you ask me,
Francamente, se você me perguntar,
after Bob Dylan,
depois Bob Dylan,
and until Nirvana,
e até o Nirvana,
for that 25-year period or so,
por esse período de 25 anos, mais ou menos,
all of the true innovations in rock music came from British musicians.
todas as inovações da música vieram de músicos britânicos. Perdão.
That's my opinion.
Esse é o que ele, essa é a opinião dele.
And it is because of those cultural influences.
É por causa dessas influências culturais e
artistic influences
influências artísticas
that British musicians and their audience had.
Músicos
That
britânicos.
Americans just didn't.
É por conta disso que músicos britânicos e sua audiência tinham uma coisa que os americanos não tinham.
I think it would be difficult to name a single version of rock music between 1965 and 1990 that developed originally in the United States.
Seria difícil nomear um estilo musical, uma banda que surgiu entre os anos 1975 e 1990 que seja totalmente original dos Estados Unidos.
I think the only one that is questionable is punk.
O único que é questionável é o punk,
which certainly the term is used first here in the United States.
que o termo foi originalmente utilizado aqui lá nos Estados Unidos, aliás.
But between the two bands, the Talking Heads or the Sex Pistols, which do you think is more punk?
Mas entre as bandas Talking Heads e Sex Pistols, qual que você consideraria mais punk?
In terms of like cultural, political, for that matter, economic intent.
Em termos culturais, políticos e musicais.
British punk is much more groundbreaking and influential than the Talking Heads, Television, Blondie, or for that matter, even the Ramones.
É por conta disso que o punk britânico é muito mais avassalador do que o de outros lugares. Então ele exemplifica Talking Heads. Sorry, you said Talking Heads and what other bands?
Television, Blondie.
Television, Blondie.
And you know the Ramones, which are usually taken as the most exemplar punk band.
E os Ramones, que tinham sido tidos como a banda mais punk que existia.
That's just my opinion.
Mas é só o que ele acha.
But I think that comes from those romantic influences and the influences of the empire.
Mas ele acha que isso tudo veio das influências românticas do Império Britânico.
That's what makes British music. That's what makes it possible to market it.
É o que faz com que a música britânica seja possível de ser vendida.
certainly they borrow American marketing techniques,
Eles com
but there has to
certeza
be something there has to be some substance underneath it.
eles emprestam essas técnicas, mas tem que ter alguma coisa debaixo disso.
I guess I would say it's not just kitsch,
Ele diria que não é só kitsch,
in my opinion.
na opinião dele.
Só um complementozinho, Lívia. Pergunta para ele. Eu concordo, diga que eu concordo com o que ele disse, mas no caso dos Estados Unidos tem um músico de rock que me parece, né, minha opinião, ser bastante influente no meio musical, que é o Jimi Hendrix.
He thinks
Difícil
that
pensar algum guitarrista que não tenha o Jimi Hendrix como referência. Né? Você quer que eu repita?
Por favor, devagarzinho.
Diga que eu concordo com ele.
He agrees with you.
Mas eu penso que existe um músico
But
dos
he thinks
Estados
there's a
Unidos,
musician from the United States,
Jimi Hendrix,
Jimi Hendrix,
que talvez seja muito influente entre os guitarristas.
which is perhaps very influent among guitar players.
Yes. Actually, Hendrix, to me, is the exception that proves the rule.
Para ele, o Hendrix é a exceção que prova a regra.
Because he was in the when he was in the United States, he was taken to be just another black musician.
Porque quando ele estava nos Estados Unidos, ele era considerado só outro músico negro.
In a climate of inherent racism.
Em um clima de racismo inerente.
Effectively, in order to become the, recognized as the guitar god
E
that
para se tornar
eventually became,
o
he
guitarrista que
was
tornou,
advised to and did cross the Atlantic to go to London.
ele foi recomendado, ele foi aconselhado e então efetivamente ele foi se mudar, atravessar o Atlântico e ir até Londres.
Because the racial climate that he operated in would be different, and being innovative would be recognized from him.
E o clima racial que ele iria lidar seria muito melhor e ele poderia the climate he would do it would be different and he could
He would be recognized for being an innovative musician in
e
London.
ele seria reconhecido como um músico inovador em Londres.
In a way that, in the US, he would just be another guitarist on the James Brown circuit.
De forma que nos Estados Unidos ele seria reconhecido só como outro músico do circuito do James Brown.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
One more question.
Okay.
Outra do Ricardo Arruda. Nas bandas psicodélicas, nem sempre ouvimos músicas que possuem elementos experimentais e acabam por reproduzir aspectos comuns da música pop, como fazer músicas com estrofe e refrão. Você acredita que isso ocorre por causa da contradição da juventude, que se pretende revolucionária, mas que ao fim está ligada aos valores da classe média, como você nos disse? Certainly, the psychedelic bands do not always produce music with experimental elements and sometimes end up reproducing common aspects of pop music, such as creating songs with verses and choruses. Do you believe that this happens because of the contradiction of youth that claims to be revolutionary but ultimately is connected to middle-class values, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, effectively, you just described the paper.
Sim, efetivamente você só descreveu o que ele falou.
Yeah, ultimately, yes. That kind of gets back into what the original purpose of the music is.
Isso retoma um pouco qual que é o propósito original da música.
Which, I would again say that I think British bands do this better than the American bands.
que ele diria que é exatamente o que as bandas britânicas faziam melhor do que as bandas americanas.
Of trying to recreate a trip.
Tentar recriar uma viagem.
Pink Floyd being an example.
Sendo Pink Floyd um exemplo.
Going from writing verses and jangly pop hits like See Emily Play.
Indo de versos para going from verses to
The
See Emily Play. Oh,
yeah.
It's a song.
See Emily Play.
Yeah. Writing basically pop songs to writing extended instrumental compositions.
E descrevendo músicas pop para músicas com instrumental.
Like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun.
Como eu sei, é uma música também. Set Controls of the Heart of the Sun.
Yeah. So, does that answer the question?
Você responde a pergunta?
Yes.
Okay.
Só uma coisinha, Nível. Já são quase 2 horas que nós estamos aqui. Talvez seja a última agora, sim, né? Até para...
não tem mais pergunta.
Não?
Não. Ok.
Então, fala para o David que a gente está encerrando aqui, até pelo adiantado da hora, e que nós gostaríamos novamente de agradecer muito. Ele é um historiador e nós estamos aqui entre historiadores, num departamento de história. Você quer ir traduzindo?
Yes.
Devido a nós já estamos
só um
a 2 horas.
Não, desculpa, achei que tinha mais uma pergunta.
Eu acho que até tem outras perguntas. Você quer fazer a última e a gente
pode ser.
Mas avisa ele que vai ser a última, e aí a gente encerra, por causa da hora também.
Yeah. Due to the time, this is the last question. Okay. We thought we didn't have another one, but we do, actually. Just a second. Da Natália Imaizumi, professor David Simonelli, muito obrigada pela excelente palestra. Tendo em vista a ideia do rock psicodélico como um veículo para a revolução na música She's Leaving Home, podemos pensar no desejo dos jovens de romperem com o tradicionalismo de seus pais e terem sua própria liberdade de escolha e valores. Nesse caso, pensamos no rock psicodélico como uma forma de libertação das circunstâncias e fuga da realidade. É possível dizer que o rock progressivo manteve essa característica utópica? Professor David Simonelli, thank you very much for the excellent lecture. Considering the idea of psychedelic rock as a vehicle for revolution, in the song She's Leaving Home, we can contemplate the desire of young people to break away from the traditionalism of their parents and have their own freedom of choice and values. In this case, thinking of psychedelic rock as a means of liberation from circumstances and an escape from reality, can it be said that progressive rock maintained this utopian characteristic?
I think what the question is asking whether you can find it on an individual basis, like the protagonist of She's Leaving Home, as opposed to just a community basis. Am I right?
Ele pergunta se essa música, se a pergunta se refere a um individualismo ao invés de... Could you repeat, please?
Is it right to think that the questioner is asking me whether you can achieve like a personal, individual revolution of circumstance?
Ele quer saber se a pessoa que está perguntando quer saber se ele está se tratando de uma revolução pessoal, ao invés de...
Listening, as opposed to it being like a community thing.
Ao invés de ser uma coisa da comunidade.
Bom, eu não posso falar pela Natália, mas acho que seria no sentido comunitário mesmo, não individual, embora
He believes it's more in a community sense, not individual.
Oh, it's in a more community sense. Well, I love She's Leaving Home.
Ele ama She's Leaving Home.
It's just such a beautiful song.
É uma música linda.
It's about an actual young girl.
É sobre uma garota jovem de verdade.
Who had danced on Ready, Steady, Go when the Beatles played there in 1964.
Que tinha dançado em Ready, Steady, Go em 1964 com os Beatles.
And they found out, Paul McCartney found out 3 years later that she had run away from home to be with a much older man who worked for a car dealership.
E aí ele descobriu, o Paul McCartney descobriu 3 anos depois que ela tinha fugido de casa para ficar com homens muito mais velhos que trabalhavam negociando carros.
I guess you could look at that as a opening of minds.
Ele acha que você pode ver isso
Song.
como uma abertura da mente, principalmente na música.
The song certainly would argue that she was
A música com certeza discute que
the song actually says she's having fun.
a música na verdade diz que ela está se divertindo.
But the idea is that she is changing her circumstances.
Mas a ideia é de que ela na verdade está mudando as circunstâncias dela
In order to be happy.
para ser feliz.
And in the setting of Sgt. Pepper, I think you can call it psychedelic.
E na ambientação de Sgt. Pepper, você pode considerar então isso psicodélico.
But it's such a delicate song, it's hard to call it psychedelic standing on its own.
Mas é uma música tão delicada que é difícil chamar ela de psicodélica.
The reality of the girl's circumstances says that, she's just this teenager who is infatuated with an older man that she ends up, leaving in the long run.
E na verdade é sobre uma jovem adolescente que deixa tudo e vai atrás de homens muito mais velhos que ela.
I guess, yes, it is representative of a revolution of circumstance.
Ele acredita que sim, ela é representativa de uma revolução de circunstâncias.
But it's easy to tear down the facade and see it for something different.
Mas também é muito fácil observar ela em detalhes e ver que ela é sobre outra coisa.
That makes sense?
Faz sentido?
Sim, yes.
Okay.
Bom, tem mais alguma questão no livro?
Não recebi mais nenhuma.
Bom, então vamos voltar ao que eu estava falando. Por favor, diga aí ao professor David que nós adoramos a presença dele. O grupo de pesquisa agradece muito a presença dele, a participação dele.
Professor, we would like to thank you for your presence, and especially the study group appreciates very much of your lecture and your presence here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this.
Ele gostou muito do agradecimento.
Eu recebi várias mensagens de WhatsApp pedindo para que o professor David voltasse outras vezes.
We got many messages asking for you to come back more times.
Oh, good. All right. Great. All right. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Com certeza.
That'd be terrific.
Seria ótimo.
Ah, já está convidado.
You're invited.
Okay, great.
E...
Bring me to Sao Paulo.
Ele
Yes.
chegou para São Paulo.
Bom, então é isso. Nós agradecemos muito, muito mesmo. Foi fantástico a fala, as respostas, a presença dele. Foi tudo muito bom.
Your answers, your lecture, everything was wonderful, and we are really thankful for it.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
E que
Realmente agradeço.
nós
Love the
todos,
opportunity.
e que nós todos agradecemos, e eu em particular, porque ele gosta de She's Living Home e eu adoro também.
Everybody thanks, and especially Adriano, because you also like She's Living Home.
Yeah.
Thank
Great
you, Dave.
help.
Thank you very much, very much.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Ele que agradece.
Until the next.
Até a
Yeah. Right.
próxima.
Até a próxima. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you. Thank you.
Yes. Ficamos por aqui, então? Pode encerrar, César.